London, spring of 1814. The season had returned with all its usual brilliance, silk gowns, gilded carriages, and the endless chatter of who might marry whom. Yet amid the whirl of music and mirth, there existed a marriage so still, so cold, that London society had learned to speak of it only in whispers. The marriage of Eleanor Whitby, Duchess of Pembroke, and Alexander Hawthorne, the Duke himself, had once been the envy of every debutante and dowager alike, a match of beauty and power. The daughter of a viscount, wed to one of the wealthiest men in the kingdom, their wedding had graced the pages of every gossip column, described as the perfect union of grace and dignity. But perfection, it seemed, had an expiration date. For 5 long years, the Duke and Duchess of Pembroke had lived as polite strangers beneath the same roof. They dined at the same table, but spoke only of weather or charity. They attended the same gatherings, but never shared a dance. To the world, their marriage was impeccable. To those within Pembroke Hall, it was an echoing silence carved in marble. None that particular evening. Pembroke Hall shone with its annual spring soirée, chandeliers blazing, violins sighing, and guests gliding across polished floors, as if sin and sorrow had been outlawed. The Duchess stood at the edge of the ballroom, pale gold silk cascading around her slender frame. Her hair, the soft hue of honey caught by sunlight, gleamed beneath the crystal lights. "Her Grace looks divine, does she not?" whispered Lady Fairchild to her companion, hiding her words behind a fan of white feathers. If only her husband found her half so interesting. The ladies giggled. Eleanor heard them, she always did, but her expression never faltered. Years of practiced indifference had turned her serenity into armor. She moved among her guests like poetry, greeting, smiling, exchanging the required pleasantries. Inside, however, her thoughts drifted like ghosts through corridors she no longer entered. Corridors leading to her husband's wing of the house. The Duke of Pembroke was a man of formidable reputation, brilliant, disciplined, and as unreadable as winter frost at 35 and 30. His hair carried the faintest trace of silver, his gaze the calm authority of a man accustomed to command. In Parliament, his word carried weight. In society, his approval was currency. But to his wife, he was only absence, a void where affection should have been. And yet, Eleanor had not stopped feeling. She had not stopped remembering the man who once looked at her as though she were both sin and salvation. When Alexander entered the ballroom that night, a hush rippled through the crowd. He was seldom seen at such gatherings now. His tailored black coat, crisp cravat, and solemn bearing gave him the air of a statue, sculpted, perfect, and utterly untouchable. Their eyes met across the room. For one unbearable second, the music seemed to slow. He inclined his head in acknowledgement. A simple gesture, one any stranger might offer, but it sent something trembling down her spine. Later, as she stood near the grand staircase, he approached her. "Your Grace," she greeted, voice steady but soft, like a fragile note in a cathedral. "Duchess," he replied. His tone was formal, yet his eyes lingered longer than propriety demanded. "I was told you would not attend," she murmured, her fingers tightening on her glass of champagne. "Nor did I plan to," he said, glancing briefly toward the orchestra. "But tonight, I found myself unable to keep away." She tilted her head slightly, her lips curving in a humorless smile. "And what calls you here, my lord? Boredom or guilt?" He looked at her then, really looked. Neither restlessness, perhaps. Then, lower, as if speaking to the memory of her instead of the woman before him, or a haunting, "I can no longer silence." Her breath caught. "You should have said such things 5 years ago." 5 years ago, he said quietly, "I believed silence was mercy." Later that night, Eleanor stepped onto the terrace for air. The city stretched beyond the gardens, distant lights like trembling stars. She had survived loneliness before. She would survive it again, but the sound of approaching footsteps made her turn. Alexander stood there, hands clasped behind his back, the mask of the perfect Duke still in place, but his eyes betrayed him. "I did not mean to intrude," she said. "You didn't." He took a step closer. "Do you ever wonder," he began slowly, "how long a man can pretend not to feel?" 5 years, it seems," she replied coldly. His jaw tightened. Eleanor. Her name left his lips like an unspoken prayer, one too long suppressed. I built an entire world of distance, he said, because being near you reminded me of what I could not deserve. Her pulse quickened. And what is it you think you do not deserve, Alexander? You, he said simply. The moment hung between them, delicate and dangerous. Inside, violin soared, laughter rang. But out here, under the silver wash of moonlight, time seemed to hold its breath. For the first time in 5 years, the Duke of Pembroke looked at his wife, not as duty, not as title, but as the woman who haunted every silence of his soul. And though no words of love were spoken, both knew this night had broken something open. Neither would sleep easily again. The following morning, the sun rose pale and soft over the sprawling gardens of Whitmore Hall. Dew clung to every blade of grass, and the air smelled faintly of roses. Eleanor had hardly slept. Her mind spun endlessly around the Duke's words, his eyes, the weight of his voice when he'd said her name. She stood at her vanity, fingers trembling slightly as she fastened the last pearl of her collar. In the mirror, a woman stared back, one who had survived 7 seasons without a single proposal worth her dignity, one who had resigned herself to quiet spinsterhood. And yet, that same woman had somehow caught the attention of the Duke of Ashbourne, a man whispered about in every parlor and drawing room across London. "Miss Harcourt," came her maid's hesitant voice from the doorway. "His Grace is here. He requests your company for a walk in the gardens." Eleanor's breath hitched. "At this hour?" she asked, though her pulse already knew the answer. "Yes, miss," he said, "the morning suits you." That was precisely the sort of thing the Duke would say, seemingly polite, yet laced with an intimacy that made her chest tighten. The Duke stood near the fountain, his tall figure outlined by the weak sun. He wasn't dressed for charm or flattery, no embroidered waistcoat, no fashionable cravat, just dark wool, a riding coat, and boots still damp with dew. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and that piercing gaze found her instantly. "Miss Harcourt," he greeted, voice low. "I was beginning to think you might not come." "I was considering it," she replied, lifting her chin slightly. "You seem to enjoy surprising people, Your Grace." He smiled, a rare, almost dangerous sight. "Only those worth surprising." And Eleanor looked away, focusing on the marble cherubs spouting water beside them. "You didn't come here for morning strolls, Duke. Why are you truly in Hertfordshire?" His hands clasped behind his back, his tone unreadable. "Perhaps I came to see if the gossip was true." "Gossip?" "That Miss Eleanor Harcourt has rejected more proposals than any debutante in London." She met his eyes sharply. "You came all this way to mock me." He stepped closer, not close enough to be improper, but enough for her to feel the steady pull of his presence. "On the contrary, I came because I wondered what kind of woman has the courage to say no in a world that punishes her for it." For a moment, she forgot how to breathe. No man had ever spoken to her that way, not her father, not the suitors she dismissed, not even the men who had tried to win her favor through charm or wealth. "And what have you concluded?" she asked quietly. "That you are either the bravest woman I've ever met." His gaze softened, almost imperceptibly, "or the loneliest." The word struck her like a physical blow. She wanted to retort, to hide behind her composure, but something inside her gave way, a crack in the armor she'd worn for years. "Perhaps," she whispered, "I am both." The Duke said nothing for a moment. He simply looked at her, as though trying to memorize her face. Then, with a suddenness that made her heart leap, he said, "Miss Harcourt, I will not pretend to understand my own intentions entirely, but I know this. I would see you again. Will you allow it?" Her first instinct was to refuse to protect herself, as she always had. But then she saw something unexpected in his eyes. Not arrogance, not calculation, but sincerity. A man who had everything, yet still seemed profoundly alone after a long pause. Eleanor nodded. "Once more, perhaps." He bowed slightly, the faintest trace of a smile ghosting across his lips. "Then once more it shall be." As he walked away, the wind lifted his coat, and she caught a glimpse of a scar running from his wrist to his sleeve. Pale, jagged, and unmistakably violent. Something told her that the Duke of Ashbourne carried secrets darker than society could ever whisper. And for the first time in years, Eleanor Harcourt wasn't afraid of curiosity. She was drawn to it. The following week unfolded in a way Eleanor could never have imagined. Every morning, a letter arrived from the Duke of Ashbourne, never overly sentimental, yet written with precision and weight. Each line felt measured, as if every word he allowed himself to say had been through a battlefield first. He asked her about her walks, about the weather, about the novels she read. Small, almost ordinary things. And yet, beneath those words, something deeper pulsed. A quiet pull neither could deny. It was on the 5th morning that he appeared again in person. This time, he came on horseback, the sound of hooves echoing through Whitmore's gravel drive. Eleanor had been tending to her garden when she saw him dismount. Tall, composed, his hair ruffled by the wind. His dark coat dusted from the road. He bowed slightly. "Miss Harcourt." "Your Grace," she replied, wiping a trace of soil from her gloves. "You've traveled quite a distance for a visit. I find I prefer the company here to London's endless chatter," he said simply. There was something about the way he said it, too honest, too vulnerable for a man of his stature. She gestured toward the bench under the oak tree. "Shall we sit?" For a while, they spoke of harmless things, her fondness for reading, his disdain for dull dinner parties. But then, as the breeze rustled through the leaves, he grew quiet. His gaze drifted toward the horizon, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried an unfamiliar heaviness. "Do you believe," he asked softly, "that a man can atone for the past?" Eleanor blinked, taken aback. "I suppose it depends on the crime." His lips curved, though it wasn't quite a smile. "Then perhaps my sins are beyond forgiveness. You speak as if you've done something terrible." "I have," he said simply. The words hung between them, chilling and uncertain. Eleanor's instinct told her to retreat. But curiosity, that quiet, reckless thing that had been stirring inside her since their first meeting, urged her forward. "What did you do?" she asked quietly. The Duke turned his gaze toward her, and for a moment she saw not the confident nobleman society revered, but a man haunted. "During the war," he began slowly, "I commanded a regiment along the Spanish front. It was chaos, endless, merciless chaos. One night, a village was caught between our lines and the enemy's. I gave an order, one I believed would save lives." His voice faltered. "It didn't. Innocent people died. A family, a woman and her son, caught in the fire, meant for soldiers." Eleanor's breath caught. The image was too vivid, too cruel. "When I returned to England, they called me a hero," he continued bitterly. "They pinned medals to my chest and toasted to my victories. But the truth," he clenched his jaw, "the truth doesn't leave you, Miss Harcourt. It lives inside you, festering, reminding you that you cannot outrun the things you've done." She sat in silence for a long time. Then softly she said, "You were at war, Your Grace. You followed orders. No one blames." "I do," he interrupted, his tone sharp, pained. "Every day." The rawness of his voice startled her. The Duke of Ashbourne, the man of composure and control, was unraveling before her eyes. Without thinking, Eleanor reached out and placed her hand over his gloved one. "Then let that guilt mean something," she said. "Let it make you kinder, wiser. You cannot undo the past, but you can decide what kind of man you'll be now." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then his eyes lifted to meet hers, dark, searching, almost desperate. "You speak as though you've known pain yourself." She hesitated. "Perhaps not like yours, but enough to recognize it when I see it." He studied her for a heartbeat longer, and something in his expression softened, a quiet surrender, a crack in the armor of the man everyone feared to approach. "Eleanor," he said her name like a confession. "You remind me of the one thing I thought I'd forgotten, Mercy." Her chest tightened, heat flooding her cheeks at the sound of her name on his lips. Before she could reply, a voice interrupted from across the garden, her father, calling her inside. The Duke rose instantly, the spell between them breaking. He bowed deeply, his composure returning as quickly as it had vanished. "I must take my leave," he said, though his tone carried a weight she couldn't name. As he mounted his horse, Eleanor called out, "Your Grace." He turned back, the wind catching his coat. "Whatever you believe about yourself," she said, voice steady, "I do not think you are beyond redemption." The faintest trace of a smile ghosted across his lips. "Then perhaps," he said softly, "I shall try to prove you right." And with that, he was gone, riding into the gray morning, leaving Eleanor standing alone beneath the old oak, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and hope. Because for the first time, she suspected that his return to Hertfordshire was not merely a coincidence, it was a beginning. The rain came that night, slow at first, then in great sweeping waves against the windows of Whitmore Manor. Eleanor stood by the candlelight, her fingers resting on the letter she had received earlier that evening. It bore the seal of the Duke of Ashbourne. It was short, unlike his usual thoughtful letters. "I must speak with you before Sunday. There is something you deserve to know, something about your brother. Please meet me at the chapel ruins at dawn. Come alone." Her pulse quickened as she read the lines again and again. Her brother, Captain William Harcourt, had died 7 years ago in the Peninsular War, the very war that had scarred the Duke's soul. What could possibly connect them? Eleanor barely slept. When dawn finally broke, she wrapped herself in her cloak, tucked the letter into her bodice, and slipped quietly from the house. The air was cold, the fields soaked from the night's rain, and fog drifted over the moors like a living thing. The chapel stood at the edge of the forest, a skeleton of what it once was, with ivy clawing up its stones, and a hollow bell tower echoing the past. And there, waiting in the mist, stood the Duke. He turned at the sound of her steps. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed, and for a moment, she thought he looked older, as though haunted by something he had carried for far too long. "Miss Harcourt," he began, but his voice faltered. He took a slow breath. "Eleanor." Her name in his voice carried something she could not describe. Reverence, perhaps, or guilt. "You said this was about my brother," she said quietly. "Please, tell me." He looked away, his jaw tightening. "You deserve the truth, though it will not be an easy one." Eleanor stepped closer, heart pounding. "Whatever it is, I would rather know than live in ignorance." He nodded once, then spoke, slowly, as if each word carried a weight too heavy for him to bear. "Your brother, William. He served under my command in Spain. He was one of my finest officers, brave, loyal, principled. He saved lives, Eleanor, many lives." Her breath caught. "You knew him." "I did," he said softly. "And it was his death that has haunted me more than any other." She stared, unblinking. "You were there." He hesitated, just for a second, and then the truth spilled out like blood from a wound. "I gave the order that led to his death." Eleanor's lips parted, but no sound came. The fog seemed to close around them, swallowing the world whole. "I tried to save him," the Duke continued, his voice breaking. "We were surrounded, ambushed by French artillery. I ordered a retreat, but William refused to fall back until every civilian was safe. He stayed behind. I should have stopped him. I should have gone with him, but I didn't." He swallowed hard. "The explosion that followed, it should have been me." For a moment, Eleanor couldn't breathe. The world tilted beneath her feet. She gripped the edge of the stone wall beside her, her nails digging into the moss. "You," her voice trembled, "you gave the order that killed him." His eyes burned with anguish. "Yes, and not a day has passed that I haven't relived it. Every time I look into your eyes, I see the man I failed." Her hand flew to her chest as if to hold herself together. "All these months," she whispered, "you've been kind to me, written to me, sought my company, while hiding this. I wanted to tell you," he said, "but I couldn't find the words. How could I ask forgiveness from the one person I wronged most by my very existence?" Tears blurred her vision. "You should have told me before you made me care for you." The words hit him like a blow. He stepped closer, the pain in his eyes raw and unguarded. "You care for me." Her breath trembled, but she didn't answer. The truth was there, in her silence. He closed his eyes. "Eleanor, I did not come into your life to seek absolution. I came because your brother once saved mine." Her head snapped up. "What?" The Duke's expression softened, mournful, tender. "He saved my younger brother, Thomas, a foolish boy who strayed into danger. William found him, wounded, and carried him through enemy lines. He never asked for anything in return. Before he died, he told me to look after the ones who wait at home." He paused, voice breaking. "You were the one waiting." For a long moment, neither spoke. The sound of distant thunder rolled across the hills. Eleanor's tears had dried. but her heart ached with something deeper than grief, a kind of understanding she did not want to feel. "He died with honor," she whispered finally. The Duke nodded slowly. "He did. And I swore that day I would protect what he loved most. I thought that meant keeping my distance, until I realized that the only way I could honor him was to give you the life he would have wanted you to have." She turned away, her emotions a storm she could not name. "You don't understand. You cannot simply mend the past by offering affection or protection." "I know," he said, "but I would give my name, my fortune, my entire life, if it meant even a fragment of peace for you." She looked at him then, truly looked, and saw not the Duke society whispered about, not the war hero, not the nobleman wrapped in guilt. She saw a man who had been broken by loss and rebuilt himself through regret. And in that brokenness, she saw something achingly human. Her lips parted, but no words came. Before she could speak, a church bell tolled from the village below. Faint, distant, but enough to remind them both of where they stood. The Duke bowed his head slightly. "I will not ask for forgiveness, Miss Harcourt, but I will spend the rest of my life earning it, even if from afar." And then he turned, his cloak brushing through the rain-soaked grass, leaving her alone in the ruins, with the sound of the bell fading and the taste of sorrow lingering like smoke. Eleanor closed her eyes. A tear slipped down her cheek. For the first time since her brother's death, she whispered a prayer, not for William, but for the man who had finally told her the truth. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, as if the skies themselves shared Eleanor's grief. Whitmore Manor lay in uneasy silence. Even the servants moved softly, whispering in corridors, as though the air itself demanded reverence. Eleanor hadn't slept. Her mind replayed every word the Duke had spoken in those rain-soaked ruins. The way his voice trembled when he said, "I gave the order." The torment in his eyes, the guilt that had carved lines into his face. She should have hated him. She wanted to. But the heart, foolish, treacherous thing, refused to listen. By afternoon, a visitor arrived, Mrs. Alcott, an older widow who had once served as a nurse during the Peninsular campaigns. She carried with her a small wooden chest bound in faded leather. "My lady," she said, bowing slightly, "this came into my possession years ago after the war. It was among the Duke of Ashbourne's correspondence. I was asked to deliver it, should I ever learn the whereabouts of Captain Harcourt's family." Eleanor's hands shook as she accepted it. "You're certain this belonged to my brother?" Mrs. Alcott nodded. "I saw him write the letter with my own eyes, just before the siege of Salamanca. He said it was for his sister, should he never return." The woman's eyes softened. "He spoke of you often, Miss Harcourt. Said you were the only person who ever believed in him before he became a soldier." Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes as she opened the chest. Inside was a single letter, sealed with her brother's old signet. The parchment was worn, the ink slightly faded, but his handwriting, bold and sure, leapt out at her. She broke the seal with trembling fingers and began to read. "Me dearest Eleanor, if this letter finds you, it means I have fallen in battle, but do not let grief consume you, my clever sister, for I have lived my life with purpose, and my death too will have meaning. There is a man I wish you to remember, Sebastian Goddard, the Duke of Ashbourne. If not for him, I would have perished long ago. He has fought not only enemies across the sea, but demons of his own making. You must promise me, Ellie, should he ever come to you, see him not as a duke, but as a man trying to make peace with the ghosts that haunt him. He once saved me when I was too wounded to stand. I told him that one day he'd find someone who would see beyond his scars, and I told him that person would likely drive him mad before healing him. If I am gone, perhaps you are that person. Perhaps you'll never forgive him. Perhaps you'll hate him. But promise me this. Do not let the world tell you what a man is worth. Look deeper, for I have never known a soul more honorable than his. With love everlasting, William." The letter slipped from her fingers, the words blurred through her tears. All this time, she had carried anger for a man who had carried her brother's burden, his memory, and perhaps his love. "Miss Harcourt." Mrs. Alcott's voice was gentle. "There's something else." From her satchel, she drew out a small silver locket, dented, but still gleaming faintly in the light. Inside was a miniature portrait of Eleanor herself, painted years ago when she was barely 18. Eleanor's breath caught. "Where did you get this?" "Captain Harcourt wore it every day," Mrs. Alcott said softly. "When we found him, it was clenched in his hand. The Duke refused to let it be buried with him. He said, 'This belongs to her. Someday, she'll need to know she was loved.'" Eleanor pressed the locket to her heart. Her knees nearly gave way beneath her. "He kept this all these years." The older woman nodded. "He did. You weren't just a promise to him, Miss Harcourt. You were the reason he kept fighting." When Mrs. Alcott left, Eleanor remained in the study long after the candles had burned low. She reread the letter a dozen times, each word cutting deeper than the last. By the time dawn came again, she had made her decision. She could not allow the Duke to bear this guilt alone, not when her brother himself had asked her, begged her to see him differently. And so, dressed in her riding cloak, she mounted her horse and rode for Ashbourne Hall. The Duke's estate loomed like a citadel against the morning fog, vast, solemn, beautiful in its isolation. Servants scattered as she dismounted and marched toward the front doors, her heart hammering in her chest. The butler nearly tripped over himself when he saw her. "Miss Harcourt, His Grace is in the library," she said, already moving past him. The Duke looked up as she entered. He had clearly not slept either. His eyes were rimmed red, his cravat loosened, a half-empty glass of brandy beside him. "Eleanor," he said softly, standing at once. "You shouldn't be here." She ignored the warning. "You lied to me once, Your Grace. But now I have the truth, from the only person who mattered." He froze. "Your brother," she nodded, pulling the letter from her cloak. "He wrote this before he died. He forgave you long before I even knew your name." He stared at the paper, as if it were something holy. His lips parted, but no words came. "I came here to tell you," she said, voice trembling, "that I cannot carry hatred when my brother left me only love, and that love, it extends to you whether I wish it or not." For a heartbeat. Silence filled the room. Then, with sudden force, the Duke crossed the space between them and fell to his knees before her. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice breaking, "you must not." She reached down and touched his face. "I already have." Tears welled in his eyes. "You would forgive me." She smiled faintly, her own tears spilling over. "Not yet, but perhaps one day." He bowed his head against her hand, the weight of years of grief and silence breaking like a dam. And for the first time, the Duke of Ashbourne, feared, admired, and envied, allowed himself to weep. Outside, the rain began again, gentle, cleansing, almost like a benediction. But fate, cruel as ever, was not done with them yet. Because even as they stood together, the carriage that arrived at Ashbourne's gates carried not peace, but a letter bearing the royal seal, a summons that would threaten everything they had just begun to heal. The rain had barely ceased when the messenger arrived, a young man cloaked in the king's crimson, boots muddied from his journey, his gloved hand clutching an envelope sealed in gold wax. Eleanor watched from the grand staircase as the butler received him. Even before she could descend, the Duke appeared behind her, already sensing the weight that hung in the air. "From His Majesty," the butler murmured, offering the letter with a bow. The Duke broke the seal silently. His eyes flicked over the contents, once, twice, before he folded the letter and drew a slow, steady breath that betrayed nothing of the storm inside him. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, her voice soft but certain. He turned toward her, his jaw tight. "The crown calls upon me again." Her heart sank. After all this time. "The king never forgets his debts," he said bitterly, "nor his soldiers." The messenger bowed again. "His Majesty requests your presence at Windsor within 3 days, Your Grace. It concerns a matter of national security." Alexander dismissed him with a nod, but his gaze never left Eleanor. When the door finally shut, silence filled the grand hall like an unwelcome guest. Eleanor descended the stairs slowly. "You mean to go?" "I must," he replied. "There are things in that letter that cannot be ignored." She studied his face, the same calm determination that had once sent him into battle, that same look of quiet resignation she had seen the night her brother's letter spoke of. "Then it's true," she whispered. "Peace never truly returns to men like you." His expression softened. "Peace is a luxury men like me cannot afford, not yet." That night, He found her in the library again. She was sitting by the fire, the letter from her brother folded neatly on her lap. He approached quietly. "You read it again," he murmured. She nodded without looking up. "It reminds me that even in war there are promises worth keeping." He knelt beside her chair. "And do you still mean what you said? That you could one day forgive me?" Her fingers brushed the edge of the letter. "Yes, but forgiveness does not mean I will survive your absence." He reached for her hand, and for the first time, she did not pull away. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low and reverent, "I spent years fearing your presence, and now I fear your absence even more." She looked into his eyes, blue, gray like storm clouds ready to break, and saw the man beneath the title, beneath the duty. Not a duke, not a soldier, just a man terrified of losing what little light remained in his world. "You once swore to my brother you'd protect me," she whispered. "So do not break your word now." "I'll return," he said. "I swear it." But both of them knew the truth. Oaths made to war were seldom kept. 3 days later, the carriages assembled before Ashbourne Hall. The morning mist hung thick and low, curling around the wheels like pale ghosts. Eleanor stood at the top of the steps, cloaked in gray, her gloved hands clenched at her sides. Alexander emerged in his military uniform, dark blue, gold, trimmed, the insignia of the king's service glinting faintly in the weak light. He looked every inch the Duke again, composed, dignified, untouchable. But when he turned to her, the mask slipped. "Wait for me," he said softly. She stepped closer. "Don't ask me to wait if you do not intend to come back." His lips curved in a sad, knowing smile. "Then let me ask this instead. Remember me kindly." She shook her head fiercely. "I'd rather remember you completely." And before he could speak, she reached up and kissed him, fierce, desperate, unrestrained, the kind of kiss born, not of romance, but of survival. When they parted, his hands lingered against her face, as though he feared she might vanish. "Eleanor," he began. But no more words came. He turned, mounted his horse, and was gone, swallowed by fog and duty, and the endless pull of the past. For weeks after, no letter came. The estate fell quiet once more, the great halls echoing only with the sound of Eleanor's footsteps, and the ghost of his voice in her memory. Until one evening, as the candles burned low and the world outside was swallowed by winter, a knock echoed through Ashbourne Hall. A young soldier stood at the door, his uniform tattered, his face drawn. "My lady," he said breathlessly, "I bring word from his grace." Eleanor's blood ran cold. "Is he alive?" The soldier hesitated. "Yes." But he handed her a sealed parchment, stained with mud and wax. Her hands trembled as she broke it open. "Eleanor, if you are reading this, it means the world has again demanded too much from me. What I go to do now, I do not for the crown, but for the sake of the peace I promised your brother. And you, should I fail to return, know that you were the one mercy I was granted in this life. You are the one place I ever wish to rest." Ah, the parchment fell from her grasp, fluttering to the floor like a dying leaf. "No," she whispered, "not again." And in that moment, as snow began to fall against the tall windows of Ashbourne Hall, Eleanor Harcourt, once the woman of quiet grace and hidden fire, made a decision that would shock all of London. She would not wait. She would go after him. The night had fallen heavy upon Ravenswood Hall, blanketing the estate in a silvery quiet. The firelight from the drawing room spilled onto the polished floors, flickering across the portraits of dukes, long gone. Harriet sat before the hearth, her hands trembling as she unfolded the letter once again. The letter she had found hidden behind the Duke's desk drawer earlier that day. The handwriting was unmistakably his, every stroke precise, elegant, yet burning with restrained emotion. "If I should fail to return, tell her that I never meant to deceive her. I only wanted her safe, away from the shadows that haunt my name." Her pulse thundered in her ears. What shadows? What secrets could a man like Sebastian Goddard, so composed, so untouchable, possibly hide that he'd rather die than reveal them? The door creaked softly behind her. "Harriet." She turned sharply. There he was, standing in the doorway, his coat still damp from the rain, hair disheveled, and a haunted look in his eyes. "You went through my desk," he said quietly, not accusingly, but with the exhaustion of a man already defeated. "I did," she admitted. Because I deserve to know the truth. The silence stretched between them, sharp, fragile, unbearable. Then he stepped forward, his expression softening. You deserve more than truth, he murmured. You deserve peace, something I've never known how to give. Her eyes glistened. Then tell me why. Why hide it from me? He took a long, shuddering breath and sank into the chair opposite hers. The firelight caught his face, carving shadows beneath his high cheekbones. 7 years ago, he began slowly, my father's death was not natural. He was poisoned by a man I trusted, my former business partner, Lord Alwyn. The estate's fortune, its influence. He wanted it all, and when I uncovered his betrayal, I swore revenge. But vengeance, it cost me everything. Harriet's lips parted. You killed him. His eyes lifted to hers, cold, shimmering like steel. Number I let him live. But I destroyed his name, his family, his legacy. I made sure he would spend his days as a ghost in the world he once ruled. And I thought that would be enough. Her heart twisted painfully, but it wasn't. He shook his head. Because his son, his only son, has vowed to destroy me. And now, after all these years, he's returned to London. The realization hit her like a blow. You mean? Yes, Sebastian said darkly. The same man who invited us to tonight's masquerade at Lord Harbury's. The man you danced with last season. The one with the silver mask. That was him. Harriet's breath caught. The elegant stranger from the masquerade. The one whose voice had sent chills down her spine. He knows about you, Sebastian whispered. He knows you're the only weakness I have left. The air in the room turned cold. Harriet rose to her feet, her face pale but determined. Then we'll face him together. He looked up at her, disbelief flickering in his eyes. Then something deeper. Reverence. You would stand beside a man with blood on his hands. She stepped closer until she was standing right before him. Number I would stand beside the man who has carried the weight of other sins for far too long. A silence fell between them, charged, trembling. Then he took her hand, pressing it to his lips, his voice breaking. I never meant to drag you into this darkness. She smiled faintly. Then stop fighting alone. Outside, thunder rolled across the moors, as if echoing her words. The storm had come, and with it, the reckoning they had both long feared. But for the first time, Sebastian Goddard, the Duke of Ravenswood, did not stand against it alone. He stood with her, and somewhere deep in the shadows of London, a man in a silver mask smiled to himself. At last, he murmured, the Duke has something to lose. The morning of the duel was born in silence. The mist hung low over the moors, weaving through the tall grass like pale smoke. Ravenswood Hall loomed in the distance, its towers shrouded, its halls cold and watchful. Harriet stood by the window of the east chamber, the lace curtains trembling in her fingers. Her heart ached with the weight of what was to come. Down below, she could see Sebastian, the Duke of Ravenswood, mounting his horse. He wore no finery now, only a black coat and the expression of a man walking willingly into the grave. She ran from the window. Sebastian. Her voice broke across the courtyard. He turned sharply, eyes dark as the storm clouds overhead. You shouldn't be here, Harriet. Should be everywhere you are, she cried, breathless as she reached him. If you ride out that gate, you may not return, and I will not stand by while the man I love walks into death for the sake of pride. His jaw tightened. This isn't pride. This is debt. A debt I owe my father, and every life my vengeance destroyed. She gripped his hand fiercely. Then let me be your atonement. Stay. For me, for us. For a fleeting moment, his hand lingered in hers. Then softly, he pulled away. I swore I would keep you safe, he whispered. Even if it means you hate me for it. Before she could stop him, he spurred his horse and rode into the fog. The duel grounds were set in an abandoned meadow, the air thick with dew and dread. Lord Alwyn's son, the man in the silver mask, stood waiting, his pistol gleaming beneath his cloak. 7 years, he said coldly as Sebastian approached. 7 years since you ruined my family. I didn't ruin your family, Sebastian replied, voice low. Your father did that himself. I only revealed the truth. Lies. The man's voice cracked, raw with pain. He begged you for mercy. You gave him ruin. Now I will give you the same. He raised his pistol. Wait! The voice cut through the mist. Both men turned, and there she was, Harriet, breathless, trembling, but unflinching as she stepped between them. "Put the gun down," she cried. "There has been enough death, enough hate. Don't become the very thing you despise." "Move aside, my lady," the masked man warned. "This is not your fight." "But it is," she shouted, her voice breaking. "Because he's not the monster you believe him to be. He's spent every day since your father's death punishing himself for sins that were never his. He saved my life, my dignity, and my heart, and I will not let you destroy what little peace he's found." The man's hands shook. His gaze darted between her tear-streaked face and Sebastian's calm eyes. For a long, fragile moment, no one breathed. Then Sebastian lowered his weapon. "If it's blood you want, take mine, but spare her." Something in those words, that quiet surrender, cracked the younger man's fury. His grip on the pistol faltered, then fell. "I wanted to hate you," he whispered, "but I see now. The curse ended long before today." He turned and walked away into the mist, leaving only silence behind. Harriet rushed to Sebastian's side, clutching his coat, sobs escaping her lips. "You could have died," she whispered. He smiled faintly, touching her cheek. "For the first time in years, I wanted to live." Weeks passed. The storm had lifted. Ravenswood Hall slowly filled with light again, laughter echoing where whispers once lived. In the great hall, the Duke stood before the fireplace, a small velvet box in his hand. Harriet entered quietly, her gown the color of pale gold. He turned to her, his voice soft, uncertain. "You've stood beside me through ruin, fear, and madness. I can offer you no fairy tale, Harriet, only a heart that belongs entirely to you." She smiled through tears as he knelt, opening the box. Inside, a ring gleamed like moonlight, not new, but old, engraved with the crest of Ravenswood. "It was my mother's," he said gently. "She believed love should be fought for. I finally understand her." Harriet knelt too, placing her hands over his. "You don't need to fight anymore, Sebastian. You've already won." When he kissed her, the world seemed to still. The crackling fire, the scent of rain, the weight of years lifting from their souls. And though society would whisper, as it always did, that the Duke of Ravenswood had lost his reason, those who saw him walking through the gardens hand in hand with his Duchess knew the truth. He had not lost his mind. He had found his heart, and in her quiet strength, his redemption had taken form.